Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live. We're in Ottawa, Ontario, nation's capital, political center of the country. There's diplomats, politicians, public servants running all about the city. But until Tuesday, November the 6th, the political gaze of North America will be focused on Washington as Mitt Romney, President Barack Obama, race around the country trying to curry favor with the American people to win the presidency. Now, in Canada, we take this orchestrated circus that is the American presidential campaign and use it to engage in our own national pastime, which is anti-Americanism. And we figured, given the rise of anti-Americanism that generally goes along with the presidential campaign, we'd bring in our own expert on the phenomena, great friend of the podcast, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Mr. Aaron Boyce.
Thanks very much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, good. And we're thrilled to have you. And we will admit right up front that this may or may not be the second time we're doing this.
Which is understandable. I mean,
well, you need a practice run.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
Well, especially when you're going to call me an expert. Now you've set the stage.
Yeah, you can't screw this up.
No, I really can't.
No. Yeah, this is much more...
I can't slack like I wanted to.
No, this is much more important than your comps were.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm glad I spent all that time studying for this thing.
As I said, we're gonna explore the phenomena of anti-Americanism a little bit today, and it's something that has been prominent throughout Canadian history, and perhaps most famously put by Mason Wade in his 1965 presidential address to the Canadian Historical Association, where he talked about anti-Americanism in general. I'm going to read the quote, and it's not something I normally do is read quotes, but I think this is a really fitting one to start us off here. So he said that, quote, "For I'm convinced that if there had not been a United States, it would have been necessary for Canadians to invent one, since resistance to the American presence is the central thread of Canadian history from the early days of the French period right down to the present. Anti-Americanism is the one thing that French and English Canadians have always had in common." Wow.
Absolutely.
I know, well, at least there's something that brings English and French Canadians together.
Well, we need more, and if anti-Americanism is something, why not?
So, if anti-Americanism has played such a prominent role in this country's history, I think it's important that we truly define what anti-American is. Like, how do we distinguish maybe pure anti-Americanism from simply a disagreement with American policies or culture? So what do you think really defines anti-Americanism in Canada?
Well, I think you start off perfectly saying there, is it what is in it at its heart and at its core, what is anti-Americanism, or is it simply just a disagreement with what the United States does? A big thing you could say of anti-Americanism, of course, is their perception on the global stage, their foreign policy, even their internal policies, their social policies and whatnot. That can certainly be anti-Americanism because they do things so differently, so drastically different than us Canadians. Or it could go a little bit deeper, saying anti-American as in the rejection of republicanism, this rejection of exceptionalism, this rejection of American power. You can have it really broad or really narrow, I guess you could say. So it's really tough. I mean, there's really no one definition of anti-Americanism. Us Canadians obviously have a very good idea about what anti-Americanism is, and we may think that we're the most special when it comes to anti-Americanism, but I think more and more people are becoming anti-American as the years go on. So really what makes our anti-Americanism special? You know,
I think when we really think about it, it's that I think it's just that it's because we're so closely aligned with everything that they do.
Oh, absolutely.
And anything that happens there affects us, or at least reverberates to some extent up here. Even minor, really non-important things.
Oh, for sure.
We pay a lot of attention to. And our own Mallory Schwartz, for example, who we love here at the University of Ottawa, and I'm sure everyone out there will love once they read her stuff. If you haven't read it, you should go read it. But she's written about how the perception of the United States on the CBC and things about the military aspects and all this stuff. And it's really, it's an interesting way to think about that. The amount of time and energy that we spend just thinking about the United States.
Oh, absolutely.
When even at the exclusion of thinking about our own domestic policies.
Well, there in and of itself is what shows the interesting part of anti-Americanism. If us Canadians or a lot of the people here in Canada are anti-American, say they don't like the United States or they don't like the people or they don't like what they represent, why do we care so much about them? Why do we spend so much of our time thinking about them, talking about them, even worrying about them? I think presidential elections are probably the best time for Canadians to really beef up their anti-Americanism or their focus on the United States. You go to any newspaper across the country or the websites or anything like that here in Canada, and lo and behold, there'll be something about the U.S. election, as if the Americans picking their leader, their president, somehow has this massive effect on us. And yet I don't know why we think that it's just so important. I mean, it's another country picking their leader. When there's elections over in Europe, we pay attention, but we don't follow it to the same degree as what happens in the United States. So again, it seems almost like a contradiction. Us Canadians love to be anti-Americans, but we don't want to be at the same time maybe clandestine anti-Americans, just so that we're putting in our little jabs here and there, but we don't want to come out forthrightly and declare, yes, we hate you guys, kind of thing.
It's sort of like a little brother idea, I think.
I think absolutely.
Right? Because, I mean, at least I did this with my older brother when I was growing up. You'd go and you'd punch him and you'd poke him and hit him. And then when he doesn't want to hang out with you anymore, you're like, why don't you want to hang out with me? You're expressing this sort of disdain for them, but you still you want them to be around. Oh,
no, absolutely. It's a love-hate kind of thing. I mean, people have referred, obviously, to this continent as maybe being a family. You can look at it that one way, and absolutely Canada's that kid brother who's completely jealous of everything that its older brother, the United States, gets to do. I mean, it's true. Canadians, we are so jealous of the Americans in the United States, and for some reason, we don't know why, or at least we're not willing to admit why we're so jealous. I mean, it's a hidden jealousy kind of thing, but it's a very, very, very poorly kept secret.
And I know too, like I think the epitome of it is, at least for me, is the Blue Jays. I think they're only Canadian Major League Baseball team, and they're never on ESPN, and which makes sense to me because, well, one, they haven't been good for a few years, and
You're
also
being very, very kind there.
Yeah, I am. And also, I mean, why would ESPN doesn't broadcast in Canada, so why would they show the Blue Jays? And people call up the Blue Jays postgame show all the time and complain that, why aren't the Blue Jays ever on ESPN? Like, who cares?
No.
You can see the game. You're in Toronto. You can see the game.
No.
What's the difference if it's on ESPN? Why do we care? I don't understand.
Well, the other big thing about that is hockey. I mean, I remember I was down in Cuba this past summer, and I was able to watch ESPN down there. And now, granted, of course, that's the off season for the NHL, but obviously they were talking about there's the labor strife that's now ongoing, and prepping that. Obviously here in Canada on TSN and Sportsnet, it was number one big news to the chagrin of many people. But down in the States, it didn't even register. And I was down there in June, so it was just about the time of the NBA playoffs. And the NBA dominated coverage, and they didn't even have hockey once. And yet Canadians talk about that and say, the Americans on the ESPN, they don't even broadcast hockey. They don't even know what they're talking about for hockey. Like you said, why do we care so much? I mean, really, we like to think of hockey as our game. But why do we really care if the Americans like to pay attention to it or not? We certainly do, and we give it its due. I don't know why it's so important that the Americans do too.
Yeah, there was a really good article. I read it yesterday. I don't know when it was posted by Katie Baker, who writes for Grantland on ESPN.com, and she is their NHL writer.
Okay.
And her first 2-3 paragraphs was talking about the lockout and how so much has been written about the lockout and how, the big Sports Center episode that was the highest rated Sports Center in the United States ever, and it was dealing with the lockout, and then the end of it was like, the NFL referees lockout. Now let's talk about the NHL lockout. And it was really interesting, this counter between like the whole league is out and no one really cares versus the NFL, where these part-time employees, who obviously have a huge impact on games and stuff, but they are part-time employees, are out, and this is front page story all over the country.
Oh yeah.
It was this really interesting way of looking at it, I thought. Getting back to anti-Americanism, if we're saying that it's such a big part of Canada and our national history, is it possible, do you think, to find a defining start point of anti-Americanism? Or is it something that has just grown organically and you can't really pinpoint a date on it?
Well, it's a really good question, because I think most people, including myself, would look back to the American Revolution and the war that followed in 1775, 1776 as a really good kind of starting point, because then you have a definitive us versus them mentality. Obviously, up until that point, it was all English speakers in North America. Obviously, at that point, belonged to were subjects of the British Crown, and then the French Canadians who were added in there. But during the Revolution, obviously, you have a clear cut and dry in post 1783 when the United States is declared. squared. You've got an us versus them mentality. It's very clearly that it's no longer we're all brethren, we're all one. I mean, we all speak the same language, but that wasn't even the case anymore. So I think the American Revolution is a good starting point, but I think Mason Wade is correct as well, even beginning with the French regime, that you've got this idea of anti-Americanism, because anti-Americanism in and of itself, of course, as we look at it, is opposition to the United States. But anti-Americanism could also be this opposition to, say, North American ideas, which, of course, the United States has dominated since its inception in the late 18th century. But I think the revolutionary period is a good time to start, if nothing else.
The issue that I would have with that is, and it's sort of a little born out of my conversation that I had with John Reich on a previous podcast talking about the American perspective of the War of 1812. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to it on ActiveHistory.ca or through iTunes. It's a great podcast.
Hey, now that right there is some seriously good PR.
Isn't that good?
I like it.
But he was talking about how following the revolution, with all the loyalists going north, that there was these kinship networks that crossed the border, and people weren't really allowing the political differences or the national differences to really get in the way of their own personal connection. So while there may have been official anti-Americanism or maybe an official distrust of what was going on with the New Republic, the population on the whole, especially the places like Nova Scotia and what is now Southern Ontario, places that came to be largely dominated by loyalists, they weren't really consumed with this.
No, absolutely.
So to me, I don't think we can really use the revolution as the start of anti-Americanism, except for maybe later on.
Well, I think it's just the revolution, in my opinion, it provides that easy identifiable period. You're absolutely correct in saying that for the day-to-day lives of these loyalists who moved into British North America at the end of the revolution, they really didn't care. And in fact, in an article I read not too long ago by David Bell titled The Loyalist Tradition in Canada, he argued that these loyalists had shared many of the same Enlightenment ideals as their now American brethren, in the sense that they believed in the expansion of democracy and the expansion of liberty. The only difference is that they believed that they should still remain as part of our subjects of the crown and not form this new republic, and that is what created the shift. But I think what happened as well, of course, is over the course of history, is that these loyalists have now assumed a folklore tradition and this I can't even think of the word that describes it, but just
a mythology.
Thank you, exactly. Yeah. A mythological sense that, these are the true representations of what Canadians should be, this loyalty to the crown, this rejection of all things American. And I think that in and of itself started around the revolutionary period, with obviously the influx of loyalists coming up. But I do agree with you that it's not cut and dry.
Right.
You can't just say, okay, up until 1775 there was nothing, and then as of that year, boom, it happened.
Moving forward, then, could we maybe say that maybe 1812 is a key date for anti-Americanism, is in that those kinship networks and these connections that were back and forth, those would have been, at the very least, strained during the war, and if for no other reason, it would be difficult to go and see each other and communicate
absolutely.
back and forth. And, maybe 1812 is sort of the first point where people start to come together and think en masse, like, maybe this isn't such a good idea, and maybe we should be a little more distrustful.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. I don't understand how a community cannot be anti-someone if they invaded your territory.
Right.
I think that's a big part. Obviously, the Americans declared war on Great Britain, and so what's the most logical part to attack? Well, British North America, which is now obviously Canada. So I think that in and of itself starts off. I mean, you're absolutely going to be very opposed to a country that has invaded you,
right.
Despite your strong ties and whatnot, because especially if you identify with being a British North American at that time. But it's really interesting, obviously, as well. There are some states in the Union that vehemently disagreed with the war.
Yeah.
Many of the New England states felt totally opposed to it as well. And there, as you said, the family ties meant more than an artificial border that was drawn on a map. So absolutely, 1812 is one of those watershed moments in Canadian-American relations and anti-Americanism.
Yeah, and two, I think it's interesting because moving out of the War of 1812 after 1815, and again, this is sort of what John Reich was talking about, is that the war itself didn't really bring Americans together in the way that people like Madison thought they would. But post-war, there was this rise in nationalism and these nationalist ideologies that were born out of a sense that we had to preserve the ideals of the revolution. People felt that even if the war didn't necessarily have a clear winner that we had to preserve. It was a war for American independence and American sovereignty. And out of the war, people started to use this type of rhetoric and things like, the Constitution. And it was this rise in nationalism that really came out of the war. And that is something that I could see maybe rankling people in British North America at this point, saying even if they didn't have a perception that, hey, the British won the war, they would at least have the perception as though the Americans didn't win the war. And now they're coming up with all this nationalist rhetoric coming out of this conflict. And like, where is this coming from? And then I could see some resentment growing out of that moving forward.
Yep. Well, yeah, they often call the War of 1812 the Second War of Independence.
Yes.
And so, I mean, exactly, what a way to conflate an issue right there by declaring a separate individual war as a second war of independence and to build nationalism, out of that. To be fair, of course, Canadians did the same thing, and we continue to do so, especially 200 years later here in 2012 with all the banners that are all over the place and the celebratory commercials that are on that we're all inundated with.
Yeah, banner year for Laura Secord chocolates, I'm sure.
Oh, it's got to be.
How could it not be? But moving forward out of that nationalism, it's to me at least, it's like the epitome of any resentment that would come out of that is seen in Canadian reaction to the Monroe Doctrine. Because the Monroe Doctrine has nothing to do with British North America or Canada.
No.
It has everything to do with areas that have yet to be settled by or colonized by a European power.
Yes.
And the United States saying, if you're here, great. If you're not, don't.
Yeah.
It's our continent.
Yeah.
And yet people in Canada and the newspapers in Canada respond to this and start using terms like arrogant to describe the United States and having this and their feeling that they controlled the whole hemisphere. And I think this is the first time that you see a real public display of resentment towards the United States on an issue that doesn't directly relate to British North America. And to me, I would say that might be, if we had to pinpoint a date, I would put my date at the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay.
As the first real public expressions of anti-Americanism.
Sure. Yeah, that as you said, that has nothing really to do with British North Americans. And I think that is a long-standing problem that we've had, as we said earlier, is that for some reason we like to attach the importance of what's going on in the United States to us, and for some reason think that what happens down in Washington all of a sudden dictates policy towards us. And I think that's a really good starting point for anti-Americanism. Again, that this idea, I think I'll come back to this probably many times over the course of this recording, is the sense that this air of superiority that Canadians seem to despise about the Americans, yet we clearly seem to harbor ourselves. It's one of those contradictions about this whole anti-American idea.
And it's interesting because moving throughout the rest of the 19th century to Confederation, a lot of the principal issues in Canada can be drawn back to a sense of anti-Americanism in one way or another.
Oh, absolutely.
The rebellions, the conflict over the Oregon Territory and the Oregon dispute with James K. Polk, the American Civil War, how that was related. Like, all these issues, like, there's this tinge of anti-Americanism that comes out in these major issues through the first half of the 19th century.
For sure.
It's really just remarkable how this is a theme throughout this founding period of Canada.
Absolutely. But what's more interesting to that is that the ebbs and flows of this anti-Americanism. Obviously, we talked about the War of 1812 being a good example, and then the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. But during the 1830s, there was a rise in almost pro-American sentiment, especially among Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Patriotes, the predecessors to the Rouge movement. They were absolutely Republicans. They admired the United States, they admired their institutions and whatnot. And then in English-speaking Canada, you've got William Lyon Mackenzie, who also adored the Americans and adored the United States and this idea of republicanism. There's a big showing of outward support of the United States, which not a lot of people tend to realize or tend to think about, that the rebellions, of course, were about throwing off the monarchy and establishing republics north of the 49th. Whether or not Canada would have joined in with, or British North America, I should say, would have joined in with the United States at that time, obviously we won't know. But the sense that Papineau and Mackenzie wanted to establish republics, American-styled republics, is really important too.
Sure, and I think that's sort of one of the things that's kind of forgotten.
Oh, absolutely.
When we talk about the 19th century, we talk about all these other issues, but when we talk about the rebellions, we tend to, or at least this is my interpretation, that aspect of it doesn't get played up as much.
No, because it flies in the face of this anti-American idea that Canadians like to hold on to, that during the 19th century, as the United States developed, Canadians really developed separate of the United States, and that this Canadian identity has been growing in and of itself for so long. Not just in opposition to another set of ideas and nationalisms.
Especially the English or the Upper Canada.
Upper Canada.
Those conflicts, at least the way it's been interpreted to me, is that a lot of those ideas were actually brought in by Americans.
Oh, for sure.
And they were the ones who actually caused the rebellions.
Well, that's
and it wasn't actually an internal thing. And this is one interpretation that I have heard.
Oh, that's definitely
that it's American rebel rousers who are just coming up and causing trouble, and it's not actually Upper Canadians who are upset with anything.
Well, it definitely could explain it because, as we said before, crossing the border was so easy to do, and families obviously on either side of the borders. That the border really didn't mean as much to North Americans, I think, obviously, as it does now. Obviously, it was important. It was heightened during the war and then the period afterwards and whatnot. But that border was so easy to get between. It wasn't the roadblocks like we know today.
Yeah.
And so sharing ideas and disseminating different newspapers or ideas again was a lot easier. And so Americans to pop over the border, yell a few slogans, try to rile people up and then run back over. I mean, why not?
Sure.
You could do it. It's easy.
Of course. And I wonder too, given that it was so easy to go back and forth, I wonder how much the rebellions in Manitoba and Louis Riel going to the United States and using that as a safe haven, if you will, how that was perceived by people back in at least Upper Canada and I guess Lower Canada as well, because Louis Riel wasn't a particularly popular figure in those areas, and then you see him escaping to the United States, and perhaps that would further any ambivalence that you're feeling towards the United States because they're harboring this fugitive.
Oh yeah.
Or at least that would be the sense that they have at the time, and that would just further build on these emotions that already exist.
Oh, absolutely. And Riel obviously wasn't the only one. I mean, Papineau fled to the United States, so did William Lyon Mackenzie. Again, these guys, whenever times go rough, pop down in the U.S., and I think that's the problem that a lot of people see is this perception of lawlessness down in the United States, in which criminals, or at least perceived criminals, are able to just pop across the border and then disappear without the Americans actively trying to get involved and doing anything about this. Whether for right or wrong, they should have got involved. But I think you're right. Opinion and attitude towards the U.S. at that time, Canadians were probably pretty upset.
Going forward then, would you say that given this backlog of anti-Americanism that we've seen throughout the 19th century, would you say that anti-Americanism is a founding principle of Canada?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Just point blank.
Point blank, yes. Well, because it's everywhere. It's one of those things. I feel as though it's an inherent trait of a Canadian, whether thoughtful or just prejudiced ideas or whatever. That it's just there.
Do you think then, like going into Charlottetown in 1864, do you think these guys are getting together and saying like one of the primary focuses for them is the United States and protection against them? This is what I mean. Like. Going into Confederation through the 1860s, so you have like Cartier and MacDonald and these people getting together. Is this a primary focus for them?
Well, why not? I mean, it's been very clear that the fathers of Confederation were looking down at the U.S., especially if obviously they were engaged in the Civil War at that point, and they looked at it and said, okay, this is what not to do for a government. This is clearly what not to do. I mean, you've got a government that is a central government that is so weak that it allows individual states to secede. This rampant mass democracy is so out of control that anyone can do whatever they want, kind of thing like that. And so these guys, our fathers of Confederation, looked south and went, no, we can't do this. Adhering to these British principles as a rejection of American republicanism. I mean, I don't know how more anti-American you can get than a clear and decisively rejection of the American Constitution and their formation of government.
But then how was these meetings in Charlottetown and eventually a Confederation, if it was formed at least in part on an anti-American platform, how is this perceived then in the United States? Because you've written about this.
I have looked a little bit at this, and it's actually quite interesting because opinion towards Confederation in the U.S. varied considerably. Now, granted, most of the research that I've done about this has really taken place in the northern states. Southern opinion really doesn't exist as much from what I've been able to find. But at least in the northern states, it fluctuates from outright hostility to support, but the majority of the people were kind of neutral about it. They didn't think one way or the other. They just kind of thought, oh, okay, it's another nation. There pretty much already was one up there. They're not republics. Okay, no, that's all right. We can deal with that. And it really was. There's just this, I don't want to use neutrality, but it really just seemed like they didn't care, for better or for worse. I mean, you've got some articles, of course, going out there saying that it's a terrible thing, transplant or keeping the monarchy. I believe it was a representative from Maine who called it the great conspiracy on this continent, that Canada exactly confederated. I mean, how much more... or what more strong language can you use to describe Confederation? Whereas, of course, you've got others. I believe it was in Chicago. There were a couple articles saying that the Americans want to congratulate the Canadians for picking their government and making sure that they did it in the way that was best for them, because obviously a founding idea in the United States is personal liberty, and whatever a certain state wants to do, it should be allowed to do it without internal or external threat. And so for many Americans, they looked at Confederation saying, well, these Canadian people have decided that this is what they want to do, we will support them. Yeah, they're not a republic, we're not too thrilled about that, but at least they're doing it how they want to do it. And then, of course, others thought, well, once they're more independent from Britain, we'll just annex them anyway, so it didn't really matter.
Yeah. That's true, and there's one, like, I know that, like, papers like the Toronto Patriot and stuff had criticized the American form of democracy, and used, the Toronto Patriot in particular had used words like, had referred to it as a unbalanced democracy, and that you had to be suspicious of it, and that it wasn't a good way to govern. And so I can understand how going forward through Confederation that you, if this is how people feel, even if it's not a majority, even if you have 40-45% of people who feel this way, it'd be difficult to set up a similar style of government. And then so you bring in a different style, but something that is more of a balance between a monarchy and a republic. And I think it is sort of this almost a hybrid type system that's been created.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at it, the Canadian Confederation and the Constitution is not a complete outright rejection of everything American, nor, of course, is it a complete adoption of everything that's British. I think you're right that it's a good harmonization, but I think that's the position that Canada's in, of course. Canada is in that unique position in the sense that it's a North American nation, and this idea of the New World being open to new ideas and whatnot, but it's still tied to Britain and ideas that work. Clearly, the Constitution of Britain works. It's working for the British. It's a great system. It's working for us now. So Canada's kind of has the best of both worlds, to see what not to do plus what to do and mold them together.
So moving out of Confederation then, and we have this country that founded, at least in part, in anti-Americanism, would it be fair to say that the next great boon of anti-Americanism is 1891 and the election?
Well, of course, the 1891 election being that very, very famous election, and MacDonald's a British subject I was born, a British subject I will die. Pretty much every Canadian, I believe, is taught that idea that MacDonald fought against this rampant treason. Now, I'm a little skeptical about this. The 1891 election seems to be, it's going to be focusing a large part in my dissertation that I'm looking at. So I'm not entirely convinced that this wave of anti-Americanism actually saved Canada from anything. I know that there are obviously the two ideas that MacDonald died a martyr to save Canada from being annexed to the United States. I'm in the other camp in which, anti-Americanism was important because the sentiment was around, but it really wasn't that as much of a threat as I think other people have made it out to be, or mythologized MacDonald and his actions here and this great, huge savior election kind of thing.
But what about, like, the Patricia Wood article on the advertisements used, the conservative advertisements in the campaign? I think it's a really good article because it's very illustrative of the fact that the United States was demonized, like quite literally demonized in these advertisements.
Oh, absolutely. As
being this evil force, and you see Canada represented by these, small, like, very thin, or that's not a good way to put it, but these women who needed to be defended.
Very
and
frail.
That's how Canada is or represented in these posters. And then so MacDonald is the big hero who's protecting this Canada from this ogre that is the United States.
Yeah, this very unflattering image of Brother Jonathan or Uncle Sam.
Yeah, and usually with a menacing look on their face.
Oh, absolutely. Very greedy. And ogling, I think, is another good word to use.
Yeah, and that has to have some sort of a long-term effect
on
the psyche of people when you're just battered with these images throughout an election campaign.
Oh, there's no doubt. Part of it, of course, well, what's oftentimes forgotten is that the 1891 election really was fought about reciprocity. It was about free trade with the United States. And MacDonald and the Conservatives were so successful in turning the Canadian people off of reciprocity that when it reared its head again in 1911, Canadians almost flat out rejected it. In fact, when Prime Minister Laurier tried to get it passed and the Americans were enthusiastic about it, Canadians flatly rejected it and then elected Robert Borden instead and dumped the Liberals. So I think you're absolutely right. This long-lasting perception of free trade or anything closer associations with the United States being detrimental to Canada, and Canadians held on to it for a generation. 20 years later, the same battles were basically being fought.
Yeah, and do you think that representation and that it was so prominent and it continued through after MacDonald's death, do you think that ultimately helped his legacy?
Oh, for sure. Again, I think it's one of those weird things in Canada that anytime a prime minister or a public figure stands up to the United States, we like to idolize them. Again, standing up to the big bully who's trying to dominate. And there's no doubt that Macdonald definitely stood up for what he believed in, what he believed as the best course for Canada. So there's absolutely, you can look at him as a hero for that. Another way of looking at it is that he held Canada back by not allowing this free exchange of goods between Canada and the United States. Obviously, the liberal argument during that time is you've got a population of 5 million versus a population of over 80 million. And you want to get access to that market. I mean, why not? So again, there's two ways of looking at it. There's the anti-American idea and then the not so anti-American idea.
Yeah, but the not so anti-American idea doesn't really get talked about.
No, it's a little overshadowed.
Yeah. Because we like, as you say, we like our politicians to stand up to them a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, for Pearson, the things that we remember is 1, Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
2, LBJ.
Oh, absolutely. When LBJ grabbed him by the lapels and shook him. Oh, yeah.
Like, those are the 2 things that we remember about.
Oh, for sure.
And one of them, you could say, Nobel Peace Prize. Hey, that's kind of important. He did something really good. The LBJ thing is an anecdote.
Oh, yeah. It's a side note.
Yeah.
Like 2 guys who didn't like each other.
Yeah, like that's it. But yet it's probably the second. I would say it is the second most recognizable thing about his life.
Oh, I would agree, absolutely.
Which is kind of a shame because he actually did a lot of really good stuff.
Oh, he did, and exactly that's where it comes down to. You've got one thing where he stood up to the Americans, or this representation of him standing up to the Americans, and then LBJ being that big American bully, grabbing him by the lapels, shaking him, and telling him what to do, and yet he held his ground, and so exactly, hero to Pearson.
Now, so you brought up reciprocity in 1911 and that election, and how there was still this ambiguity towards the idea in the United States in general. Now, moving forward through the rest of the first half of the 20th century, do you think that the United States not entering the First World War right away, not entering the Second World War right away, do you think that these were contributing factors to a building anti-Americanism? Because you can see in the second half of the 20th century that there's a pretty clear opposition towards a lot of American foreign policy in Canada. Now, do you think that these 2 events in the 2 world wars played a significant role in that?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Definitely for the First World War, that comes to mind, of course, is in the sense that at the beginning, of course, I don't think there was, in the sense that Canadians rushed to enlist because they thought the war would be over by Christmas. They thought it would be a very, very short war. Even into 1915, near the end of the year, it was starting to drag on a little longer than, of course, anyone wanted it to, but I still think the optimism was high. I think it was really more after the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 that you maybe could start to see Canadians kind of saying, okay, what's going on here? I mean, it's no longer now, or especially because the propaganda machine is now turning out not just, okay, we need to win this war. It's we need to win this war for democracy. We need to save the world from this German beast that is going to terrorize the world. And so I can totally see Canadians who would buy into that and say, well, what about the United States? They're a democracy. Don't they care? And so I think there's a lot of people that would look back on the war, and especially Americans that love to say, oh yeah, we helped to win the First World War.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're in for a year and a half, and you had high casualties, considering that you were only in for a year and a half. So I can see a lot of people being cheesed off about that, saying, why aren't you getting involved? This is a war for democracy, and you being the poster child, or trying to be the poster child for democracy, why aren't you getting involved?
To me, at least, it'd be Woodrow Wilson campaigning.
Yes.
On I'm the president who kept us out of the war.
Yeah.
How I could see how that would rub some people the wrong way in Canada.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, Canadian men and women had been sacrificing for 3 years at that point, and then the Americans, full of wealth and money and affluence. All 3, I guess, of the same words now that I think about it. But the Americans sitting back and enjoying life, and while all these other democracies around the world are fighting.
Mm-hmm. And it's true, and it's not just the wars, because during the interwar period when you have the Depression, I know, R.B. Bennett, who I really enjoy. I'm a big R.B. Bennett fan.
Yeah, I read that book review that you did about him. It was really good.
Well, thank you. It's we'll talk about it later.
Sounds good.
When we promo stuff. And we'll see how much I really like him when we do the Prime Minister's Fantasy Draft later.
Well, yeah, because we don't pick him high.
I know, it'd be really hypocritical.
You know you're going to be the only person that picks him.
I know, that's why I think I could probably get him late, though.
Well, then maybe I might have to swoop in and steal him if I think he's good.
That'll be a strategy. That'll be a strategy debate. But so he's elected in 1930, and he's paired for the first 2 years of his term as prime minister with Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1928. And Herbert Hoover wasn't a particularly popular character in the United States, but especially so in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
To the extent that R.B. Bennett, whenever he had to go to Washington on any sort of meetings or trade missions or whatever, he either didn't tell the press, or if he told the press, he wouldn't let any photographers come. Because he did not want a photograph of him and Herbert Hoover in Canadian newspapers.
Yeah.
Now, I think that really shows the extent to which Canadians were resentful of at least this president, if not the country as a whole, during the Depression, and this feeling that it was the United States who started it, and now we have to suffer the consequences of their actions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Great Depression obviously wasn't just the crash on Wall Street that caused this period of economic malaise, but yeah, I can totally see a lot of people looking back at the crash in October of 1929 as being the definitive moment of causing the Depression. And where to start? The U.S. This idea of irresponsibility and overspending and whatnot that the Americans just really seem to show no care for, whereas Canadians were quite worried about it. I think that's a great example of a Canadian Prime Minister being very politically savvy, making sure that, showing best face, and if best face is avoiding the U.S., well, then do it.
Sure, yeah, why not? And
then, of course, Bennett unfortunately had the mistreatment because FDR was elected very soon thereafter, and then Bennett looked like a bumbling idiot at times as compared to Roosevelt and his New Deal and whatnot.
Sure, well, but who wouldn't compare to Roosevelt?
No, that's very true. I'm just saying it's one of the poor things of history that Bennett just kind of got stuck with it.
He had the worst timing of any prime minister.
Oh, he really did.
Like, it's just awful. Like, for him, just awful.
This has really got to impact your decision of where you put him in the fantasy.
I don't know, but I'll tell you, I think if everybody reads the P.B. Waite book that just came out last year about R.B. Bennett, it would definitely help his status, and then would help me pick him high in the fantasy draft.
Yeah, because if people don't like your picks, they may sink you.
I know. It is the public votes.
Absolutely.
So I mentioned moving forward throughout the rest of the 20th century, we see this anti-Americanism, and it's, I think, more commonly presented as representation of anti-Americanism in Canada. Things like about the Vietnam War and nuclear weapons and all these things.
Oh yeah.
And then you get into the post 9/11 period and George Bush and Iraq and all this stuff. Now, this is a question that we've talked about before, and we've had difficulty answering this question.
Oh, I know where you're going with this one.
Who is the most all-time disliked American figure in Canada?
Now, before I answer that, I'm going to let it sit for just a quick second. I'm obviously stalling for time, but I'm letting the audience think about it as well, because they're probably thinking the exact same thing. Wow, who is the most hated? I think the easiest one that comes to mind, of course, you already mentioned, George Bush.
Yeah.
That anti-Americanism with George Bush just kind of went off the chart post 9/11. And I mean, it's still lingering, obviously. A lot of people are still saying that the Americans are screwed because of what Bush did to them for 8 years. And we've talked about this how many times? Asking who's the worst.
Yeah.
And then we've asked others, we've asked our colleagues, we've asked friends. No one really has an answer except for George Bush.
Yeah.
And yet, I think at one point we also agreed that maybe James Madison and the War of 1812 for declaring this war and invading Canada. I mean, what was public opinion like towards him?
You would assume not very good.
No, it couldn't have been. I mean,
the president who is invading you.
Yeah, I mean, how are you supposed to look favorably on him?
Yeah, I don't think you can.
No.
But the problem is that whenever we talk about the War of 1812, Madison seems to skate on it. Like all these representations of the American invaders and stuff, it's just the United States. It's not Madison.
Yeah.
He's not the one who's leading this charge. It's seen as sort of a national thing.
Yeah.
And nobody sort of pinpoints or puts any responsibility on Madison himself. So I don't know if we could really use him as an example just because he doesn't.
Yeah, he's
get
not
any
the scapegoat.
No,
absolutely.
But I mentioned Herbert Hoover as a possibility.
Yeah, I'm sure people weren't too happy about it.
If you have a prime minister who feels as though he can't get photographed with the president, clearly that president is not a well-liked individual.
No. And I mean, we also mentioned another one, Johnson. LBJ probably wasn't very liked.
No.
I mean, we talked about him shaking up our prime minister very aggressively, and obviously the escalation of the American presence in Vietnam. I'm sure that
absolutely
certainly played a big role.
Yeah, and then you have Nixon as well.
Yeah, I just think everyone didn't like Nixon.
Right, nobody liked him.
Yeah, no one liked him.
Nobody liked Nixon, which is weird because, well, I don't know if it's weird, but I think it's unfortunate, at least when you watch that movie Frost Nixon, the Nixon character in the movie is portrayed as this really sweet, soft guy, and yet his public persona didn't really match his sensitivity that he had, and at the end of the movie, when he's a senile guy, you really start to feel bad for him.
Yeah.
And which is too bad, because it's one of these things that I wonder about now, is that how much do we actually know about our public figures?
Oh, no, absolutely.
And, how much of their own lives do they actually let us show, and how much is a public persona that they just put out there because they need to? Mm-hmm. Now, I have a few ideas that are a little off the board.
Perfect, let's hear them.
The first one is, and I don't know if they ever identified who was responsible for this, but in the 1992 World Series, in Game 2, I believe, in Atlanta, the United States military, whoever was responsible for carrying the flag, carried the Canadian flag upside down.
Yeah.
Here's a big international incident. And I don't know if it was ever pinned on one person, but there's an example of people really getting riled up over something.
Oh, for sure. I mean, unfortunately, that's not the only instance. I mean, how many times have we seen national anthem singers walk out and forget the lyrics to "O Canada"?
Yeah.
Or try to flub their way kind of way through.
Or they don't know the tune.
Well, exactly. And no, you're right. Canadians get really upset of that. Or more recently, there was a couple years ago in the NHL where Americans would boo the Canadian national anthem, and then there were some Canadian clubs whose fans started booing back, and it took the lovable Don Cherry to say to everyone, "What the hell are you doing? Stop doing this. That's not representation of what Canadians stand for. Let them boo our anthem, but we won't boo theirs because it's a show of respect." So no, absolutely, it's one of those.
Yeah, when Don Cherry's your voice of reason on something, perhaps you've gone too far.
Yes, but at least he did say something about it.
Yes, absolutely. Another suggestion in a similar vein, Greg Gutfeld. Do you remember him?
No.
Now, he's still on TV.
Okay.
And he's on Fox News. And a few years ago, I think it was 2007, might have been late 2006, he had a Fox News show that was on in the middle of the night, like 2 to 3 in the morning or something.
Okay.
And they did a segment. It was after somebody went to a Senate committee in Canada and said, after we leave Afghanistan, like, we basically need a break from all military operations for a year. And so the show did a segment on how Canada doesn't have a military anymore and how is it supposed to defend itself. And they aired it, and then like 3 days later, multiple, I don't know exactly how many, but multiple Canadian soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. And after they were killed, then the clip went viral.
Oh.
And despite the fact that it was recorded before, but because it went viral after, people thought it was a very insensitive thing. Peter MacKay spoke out about it. It was all over the news. And Greg Gutfeld got death threats and all this stuff.
Wow.
And I thought this would be a good example. If here's a guy who is clearly on the receiving end of a very significant backlash.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the things that people were saying was, who is he to comment about our military because he's American? There's a sense that they can't know anything about us.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the resentment wasn't so much of what they were saying, although there was a couple things of what they were saying that were like a little over the top, but I think it was mostly because he was an American. And that, like, if a British guy had said it, I don't think you have the same reaction than if it's an American.
Well, I think part of that, and I wanted to mention it, is this idea that I think in general, Canadians do know more about the United States than the average American knows about Canada. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so that's why I think we take a lot of things very, very harshly, because we know a lot about the United States. We know a lot about their public figures and a lot of what they stand for. Whereas Americans kind of guess about us, or they're just clueless.
Right.
And so a lot of Canadians take that as an air of superiority. Say, well, we know more about you, we're more educated and whatnot. And that may or may not be the case. It's just a simple case of anti-Americanism. I'm always reminded, of course, of the great joke from The Simpsons where Marge gets frustrated because it took the class half an hour to locate Canada on the map, to which Homer, of course, replies, Canada's easy to forget, all tucked away down there. I mean, I think right there's a prime example of just not knowing, Americans just not knowing about Canada. I mean, of course, Rick Mercer went down there and did numerous times talking to Americans and proved that the average American really didn't know a lot about Canada. So we take offense to that.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not entirely sure why. Because if you were to go elsewhere in the world, now yes, granted there are neighbors and maybe they should, but you go elsewhere in the world, people probably don't know as much about Canada as maybe we think they should.
No, and frankly, here's how I feel, is that if like a guy from The Daily Show came up, like a new reporter who people didn't really know that well, and asked questions similar to the way Rick Mercer did, and said like, hey, in Alabama, this happens. You could do the exact same show the other way around.
Absolutely. Because you try to make it so ridiculous to try to catch people. And guaranteed you would. Some people just kind of get caught up in the moment and believe it. They're not stupid people, but they would get caught up in it and believe it, because you've got a representative of the United States telling a Canadian, this is actually what happens.
Yeah.
And in all sincerity. So, of course, you're going to try
And they're presenting themselves as a reporter.
Oh, absolutely.
So they have
As
this
a
air of
reputable
legitimacy
source.
to them. So, yes, I definitely think you could do the same show. And there was an article that James Tagg wrote in 2004. It's called And We Burned the White House, Too. And basically he summarizes his undergraduate students' opinions of the United States. And one of the conclusions that he comes to is that Canadians think that they know a lot about the United States, but they actually don't.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of it is very superficial information. They don't really have a very intimate knowledge about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so this anti-Americanism is in part based on an ignorance of what's actually happening in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one thing I kind of want to bring up. It's very similar to that. Is that Canadians are a very funny breed when it comes to anti-Americanism. What I find most amusing is this idea that Canadians love to hark on the Americans. They love to yell about the Americans and call them stupid or call them ignorant and whatnot. And yet for some reason us Canadians cannot get enough of American culture.
Yeah.
I mean, we all go home at night and we all watch American TV. I mean, you and I, before starting this up, we were talking about The Office.
Yeah.
And American programming. And yet you don't see the same kind of people, or the same kind of conversations, rather, of people sitting around talking about Canadian programming.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen. And yet we love to watch the TV shows, watch the movies, listen to American music. But for some reason we feel as though we have the right to then complain about it. I mean, it's one of those silly things. If we're so anti-American, why don't we just shut off all American things and just focus on Canadian content? But we just won't do that.
No, we won't. Which is unfortunate, I think, because I like Canadian content.
There's a lot of great Canadian content out there. There's no doubt. But at the same time, it's one of those ignorant things, in my opinion, is to berate the Americans and then yet sit around and immerse yourself in their culture, because that is American culture. This mass-produced culture is what defines American culture. So if we're so anti-American, why do we love to lap it up so much? It's one of those things that I think Canadians just, in my opinion, need to just be a little more open-minded about.
I agree. I had one further one.
Sure.
This
one more person that...
well, not really a person group.
Oh.
I'm very proud of this one.
Oh, okay. Now you got me excited about this one.
Fenians.
The Fenians, of course.
Naturally.
Oh, yeah.
You got, come on, they're raiding.
Yeah.
Middle of the night raids, heading back to the United States. How could you not just like that?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And especially, we look back on it, especially because it was an impetus for Confederation. So we like to say, okay, it wasn't so bad, but no, absolutely those guys.
I was really proud when I came up with that one.
No, that's a very good one.
So, in summing up here, would you say, and I think I know what your answer is based on sort of that last comment that you made, ultimately, anti-Americanism good for Canada?
Yes and no.
Fence sitting.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those issues that you have to fence sit about. I mean, here I was obviously going on about how I think it's wrong to be completely against the United States. Now, I myself have my own prejudices and my own opinions about the United States. I'm not thrilled about their foreign policy sometimes. I'm not thrilled about their social welfare policies either. But as a Canadian, it's really not my business to really declare one way or the other. I'm allowed to have my opinion. I'm allowed to talk about it. But then at the end of the day, that's it.
Right.
It really doesn't matter what I think as a Canadian citizen. It's really what the Americans think of their own policies and whatnot. But for us, so no, I don't think it's good anti-Americanism, because again, like I said about culture and that and whatnot, and relations with the Americans, they are certainly our biggest ally. They're our largest trading partner, for better or for worse. Canada is always going to be attached to them geographically, because that's just how it is. So no, you don't really want to peeve off your neighbors, right? It's not a good idea. But at the same time, it's a uniting trend for Canadians.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I think will always be there, that no matter who you are, you can sit down, whether you're from Victoria or St. John's, you can sit down at a Tim Hortons and say, so, those Americans, eh? And there's going to be some sort of an agreement there. Now, I mean, how more stereotypical can I get? I don't know.
At a Tim Hortons saying...
Well, where else would Canadians sit?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, jeez. One of the most stereotypical Canadian phrase or sentence that I've ever heard is my buddy Dean, who I curl with. We were curling in a Bondsfield last year. He picked me up at, 7:30, 8 o'clock, because we were playing at 9. And we're driving down the street, and he says, do you know where the Tim Hortons is? And I said, no, I don't. And he goes, well, I need my Tims before I go curl. And if a more Canadian thing has ever been said, I don't think I've ever heard it.
No.
Like, you need Tims before you can go curl in the morning. Like, come on.
No, I think you're right.
That's the epitome. Now,
and then you laugh at me when I said sitting at a Tim Hortons.
Not at you, with you.
With me, okay.
Yeah.
Because that sounded almost like you were laughing at me for that comment.
No. I was agreeing.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Now, in addition to being our anti-American expert here on the History Slam, you also have the distinguished honor of being editor-in-chief of Strata here at the University of Ottawa.
Yes, since late 2009, I have been editor-in-chief of Strata, the University of Ottawa Graduate Student History Review, and things are going great.
Yeah, so when's the next issue? What's the situation with it?
Next issue should come out very, very shortly. We're actually just waiting to hear back about a cover image. We've got a great picture lined up. We just want to make sure that we have permission to use it. And then once that's done, a few more quick little formatting things, and then it'll be going up. So very, very soon. I wish I could give you a specific date to tell all of the listeners to check it out, but lo and behold, it will be up soon. But in the meantime, they can your listeners, wow, that was a good...
I write stuff too.
That was a good flub.
I don't write much, but I do write some stuff.
Well, no, that was a good flub. I meant to say your listeners of the History Slam can check out the previous issues online.
And the website is?
The website is artsites.uottawa.ca/strata/en.
Right. And it's also available in French. It's a bilingual thing.
Yes.
So there's a French tab in there if you want to go and look it up. You can also just Google Strata University of Ottawa.
Strata University of Ottawa is probably the easiest way to do that, because we pop up right away, and we've got the first 3 issues located up there. Lots of information. If anyone's listening who's looking into publishing anything, our email address and whatnot is all up there. So please feel free to drop us a line. We'd be happy to hear from you and keep Strata going.
Very nice. Yeah, it's a great initiative, and I've been excited to be involved in it for the past issue and a half or however long I've been involved in it now. I'm moving on from it, but
yes, you're leaving us.
I feel very confident that if it'll maintain its strong status.
Yeah, we've got a great editorial board, lots of dedicated students towards this, and we've been getting tons of great feedback about it. In fact, I believe our last issue, all of the articles that we accepted, or all except for maybe one, were actually submitted from students outside of the University of Ottawa, which was phenomenal.
Yeah, it's really becoming more of a national thing. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
I know in sort of my... I'm not a big part of it, but in my small part of it, I've been corresponding with people from as far away as Vancouver and a couple of people in Quebec, and it's been really great.
Oh yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic. So I hope that was a good enough plug. I hope your listeners will actually go ahead and look us up and see what we're all about.
Yeah, hope so. So thank you for doing this. I do appreciate it. Thanks for coming by.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I mean, hey, I'm sitting here with the Dr. Shawnee Fevers.
That's right. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And the email to the web or to the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. You can hit me up there. And if you have ideas for other podcasts, or if you want to comment on this one, you can hit me up there, or again on Twitter, or even just leave a comment on ActiveHistory.ca when this gets posted. So again, Aaron, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We'll hear you again on the Prime Minister's Fantasy Draft.
I can't wait for that.
It's going to be legendary.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Oh yes.
So we'll see you then.
Thank you very much.
And to everybody out there, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.